You have cards on your table if you want to write down a question. You'll be asked.
Absolutely.
Anybody need a pen?
Okay. Mine disappeared.
Okay. So, good evening, everybody. So, I know and recognize several faces in here. I've done this presentation several years now. It's typically the annual occurrence after the budget is proposed to City Council. City Manager's proposed budget goes to City Council. A few weeks later, I'll come attend and typically provide the same budget presentation to this group. So I would like to acknowledge I have a staff member here with me tonight, Katie James. So she's one of two of my administrators and the CIP coordinator, and really critical part of the department, and she does a lot for the city. And then with her tonight is her husband Thomas. So he came to join attendance. So y'all recruit him hard. He might end up being an active member. So anyways, with no further ado, I'll jump into the budget presentation. So the first slide here is just a high-level overview of the proposed city manager's operating budget. So several of you all know it's a pretty much a year-long process to develop the operating budget, and a lot of work goes into it. This is a one slide high-level overview of some of the things I'll be talking about a little bit later on. Overall budget growth is about 6.8%. And that might sound like a lot of year-over-year growth, and a large part of that is driven by the growth in the revenues that we're seeing. So basically, at the beginning of the pandemic, we made some pretty significant reductions in baseline revenues anticipating the pandemic. And so we've slowly been growing our way out of our estimated revenues, and the economy's rebounded much quicker than we were anticipating. So based on the current year budgeted growth to where we're seeing revenues go, that's a large part of that driver. And I'll jump into more detail of that a little bit later. Overall, FTE count, or full-time equivalent positions within the city, the proposed budget includes a net increase of about 110. That's split between city and schools. So schools growing by 58.48 net FTEs, and the city's about 52. Speak to those more in a minute, but basically roughly half of those, or more than half of those, are associated with some public safety initiatives. High-level look at expenditures. So the proposed budget does include, it provides the ability to maintain the existing services without making reductions in those. As last year, and with some uncertainty still, especially out there related to the inflationary increases and what's impacting everybody as well as city services, the budget's been positioned to provide flexibility for City Council to make adjustments throughout the year if they so choose so, to avoid negatively impacting baseline services. And again, quick look at the revenues. A lot of the revenue growth is a result of the organic growth in the revenues. There are a few tax increases proposed in the operating budget, primarily related to new initiatives such as the flood protection program, and I'll get to that in a little bit, as well as some fee adjustments in the planning department. And that last bullet point there, the FY23 proposed budget is predicated on the fair market value assessment and valuation going on with personal property vehicles. Several might recall several weeks ago that City Council took the initiative and they established, fair market value of assessed vehicles for personal property, and without that, it would have resulted in basically additional $38 million in revenue being collected in the current year that wasn't anticipated when we established the estimated revenues in the budget. And to bring that back to an assessment, basically the overall vehicle assessments are going to grow by roughly 40%. And that's pretty much as a result of chip shortage, vehicle shortages, supply chain issues has put a big demand on used vehicles. And as a result, individuals in the market, people are paying more for those vehicles. And it's just really overstating the value of those vehicles, which should be depreciating assets, not appreciating. So this is just, I pretty much jumped into that, but some fiscal relief initiatives to date. City Council's certainly been aware of the needs of residents and citizens throughout since the beginning of the pandemic. fiscal initiative or fiscal relief initiatives to date total $144 million. This is combined through several tax reductions, such as in the current year where City Council reduced real estate tax rate 2.75 cents. And some of that funding was available and provided through the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and then the CARES Act initiative. City Council was able to redirect that towards certain initiatives. And then I just spoke about the personal property fair market value, and then also recently City Council established some additional personal property tax modifications related to business and elderly disabled relief and made some adjustments in those rates. So this is just a slide talking about some demands for services and try to give a little bit of background on the history of some of those timelines I was talking about. So in FY21, as I said earlier, it was in March, and I was presenting the budget, and 1 week before I was presenting the budget in I guess 2020, they had canceled the NCAA tournament, they canceled the NBA season, and I knew this thing's very real and this budget's dead on arrival. And so from the point in time that it was proposed to what was adopted, we cut $67 million out of that proposed budget, anticipating a reduction in revenue as a result of the pandemic and shutting down basically the economy, and cut about 187 FTEs from the original proposed budget. So in FY22, City Council was able to, in the current year's operating budget, establish some new initiatives that were some top priorities to them, as well as make additional relief efforts. As I noted earlier, they reduced the real estate tax rate by 2.75 cents. Throughout the year, though, a lot of y'all might have heard or read in the newspaper or seen in the pilot about some service impact deliveries in areas such as OST, or out of school time. It's a out of school time program that our Parks and Rec delivers to provide child care services for working parents, everything after school. The children can go there and receive child care services. As a result, and I'm sure any business owner, anybody in the market right now will know that it's a very difficult time attracting and retaining help. There's a large demand for the workforce and not very many people to fill that workforce. So one service that was going to be impacted was OST. It rose to the level of a critical function where Parks and Rec was going to have to start shutting down some of these services throughout the city and not be able to provide after-school care to these children. City Council stepped in and said, hey, look, this is a priority, this is a big need for the city. So they made some adjustments and were able to allocate some resources to provide additional pay incentives to actually attract those individuals. And as a result of that, OST initiatives are still underway without an impact to any of the residents in the city. So City Council has been seeing this. So as we were working on this operating budget, City Council made it very clear early on that, hey, look, we need to maintain core services, these baseline services, and personnel is likely going to be a big component of that. So here's a high-level overview in a visual chart. Overall, I mentioned the budget's growing 6.8%, so this is the number associated with that. So the proposed budget is $2.45 billion. You can see by the pie chart, the largest proportion of those resources are associated with education at 46%. And then the second largest is the planning and public works and public utilities, so kind of the infrastructure related departments. And then the third largest being public safety at 11.8%. So the 6.8% that I've talked about is really looking at the nominal growth, really. So just year-over-year growth in what you see in the budget document to budget document. Another way that we've looked at it in the past, and something we like to try to do, is get a real measure of how efficient are we in our delivery of services, is if you take that and put that in constant dollar. So what this graph here does is the nominal that I was talking about, that 6.8% growth, the year-over-year growth, that's represented by the orange line. But the blue line there takes the annual operating budget for each of those years and backs it up to $2010. So we all know that inflation, so basically it's controlling for inflation. So we all are aware, hey, inflation right now, I think BLS is saying it's 8.5% is what the reports are coming out. So basically that means that individual, if I had $1 last year and I have $1 this year, the dollar that I have right now is worth, it's not worth the 8.5% that inflation's impacting it. A gallon of milk's gone up, so my $1 is not going as far as it did last year. So this is doing the same thing, putting the city's operating budget in 2010 constant dollars. And when that's done, you can see that dating back to that point in time, the proposed budget in FY23 is $1.738 billion, which is actually less than what the true budget was in 2010 dollars at $1.76 billion. So it's just a measure that we look at to see how we're doing in terms of trying to be as efficient as we can. Another thing that we like to do is look at the demand for services index. So what this is doing is taking several baseline core city services, such as public safety calls for services, Commonwealth attorney cases that are prosecuted, and all those, and it's putting them on an index scale. And so as that grows over time, the index goes up. If it declines, then it goes down. So you can see that this visual here really shows, tells the story dating back 2010, with demand for services growing over that period of time, with the exception of 2020 when everything was shut down with the pandemic, right? Police receiving fewer calls for service because not as many people were out on the street. EMS calls for services were going down because people weren't going to the hospital as much because everybody was isolating. And then you can see in calendar year 21, as things began opening back up, you can see that demand for services has gone back up as the calls began to come back in and everything. So over that period of time, demand for services has increased by about 16.8%. So getting in a little bit more granular level, so some of the baseline services that I've titled this one at the top, kind of keeping the lights on. So these are kind of some of the core things that need to be maintained. So one of the things that the city is a part of is the VRS, Virginia Retirement System. So it's the statewide pension system that's managed by the state, and any locality that's in it, what they do is they basically establish, the VRS establishes a rate for the locality, and then the locality pays into that. And the VRS manages their portfolio investments, the return on the investments, and what they manage their long-term liability and pension liability. And so it gets reset every 2 years. So based on the VRS rate that we were provided in the current year, to take place in FY23, that resulted in about a $6 million increase in the baseline cost for the city. The second bullet there is a fuel, energy, and inflation reserve. So this is a reserve for contingencies that's set aside. We know that inflation's real. We know that fuel costs are at a higher level than what they were a year ago at this point in time. The city received notification that its energy cost was going to go up by about 30% next year. And that kind of came a little bit later in the budget process. That translates to about $3 million for the general fund. And then if fuel were to maintain its current path, being about $4 per gallon, that would translate into a city needing about an extra $2 million to continue to purchase fuel next year at the same level that it purchased current year fuel for maintaining services like police calls, trash collection, things of that nature. And then that last bullet point is just talking about some of the other baseline needs that were, I was talking earlier about it maintains baseline services. Well, that Parks and Rec example I gave for the OST time or out of school time, well, that translated into an adjustment needed for the pay for those individuals to maintain them and keep the services provided. Well, that's in the current year, but there's a need to annualize that cost. So as opposed to increasing OST fees and the impact on those for potentially less services, the decision was made to allocate general fund resources over there to make that whole as opposed to increasing that individual fee. And looking, I'm sorry. I'll speed up because I know everybody's.
That's okay.
I know everybody. I'm talking fast. She's saying no, not faster. Okay, I'll breathe more. How about that? All right. And looking at the city's workforce, that too is what I consider a need to kind of maintain core services, keep the lights on, if you will. So the example I gave earlier, yet again, the OST time. Well, the real driving factor of that shutting down was staffing needs and shortages. So as I noted, City Council made that a top priority going into the budget process. The FY23 budget maintains existing policies put in place by council. So for example, some of you that have been attending council meetings might be aware of the public safety, longevity, and educational incentives City Council put in place for like police, sheriff, fire, EMS. The 23 budget continues that initiative as well. In looking at health insurance costs, the proposed budget is not proposing an increased cost in employees' health care premiums. And in terms of compensation, there was quite a bit of unknown and uncertainty at City Council's retreat in terms of the direction that they would like to go with compensation. So set aside in the proposed budget is a $32.8 million compensation reserve. This can be used in slice and dice however City Council sees fit, best determines how to allocate those resources, whether it all goes towards compensation or towards another initiative. City Council can make that decision. This could be used towards public safety step plan or any of those other initiatives that are the talking points right now, and what City Council is hearing from not only the public safety departments but the residents. Some public safety initiatives that are receiving additional resources to maintain those services. Probably the largest one is EMS. The city's long benefited from having primarily a volunteer EMS delivery or ambulance services and medical transportation services. However, the pandemic has resulted in a lower turnout of volunteerism. So they're struggling to fill and maintain the number of volunteers that they had pre-pandemic, which is really putting the call time, response time of a core service, a critical service. Seconds save lives, right, in this industry, in that field. So the proposed budget is recommending and putting forth the proposal to increase EMS's operating budget by 23 FTEs. So this will provide professional paramedics as well as EMTs to their baseline operations, allowing the volunteers to kind of regroup. It's not that the city's shifting away from working with the volunteer rescue squads. It's just that this is to fill that gap and that void, and then whenever the numbers get back up, it will be even more enhanced and greater level of service. With the police department, last year, about this point in time, there were several police department initiatives City Council put forward as a result of some of the events occurred at the oceanfront. A lot of those were technological investments such as ShotSpotter, some of these other databases and tech systems that the police department had requested and said would help them. Our police chief's a very tough negotiator, let me tell you. In these budget meetings, he looked across, if y'all know Chief Newdigate and y'all have met him before, he has his glasses and he lowered them. And I put a question to him, I said, Chief, I need you to explain to me what's the importance of this, what return on investment are we going to get from this if we invest in this? And he just lowered his glasses and he looked at me and he said, it'll catch bad guys. And I said, good point, fair point, okay? How do you go back at that? So the police department, they are receiving some annualized costs and plus ups associated with that. And another critical thing I'll talk about is mental health services, and that'll come in another slide. Quickly, the fire department's receiving 3 additional FTEs, safety technicians, to assist the battalion chiefs in their calls and delivery of those calls. And the Commonwealth attorneys receiving 2 additional FTEs associated with the expansion of the body-worn camera. That was, again, another initiative that came to light last year where they would like for all police departments to have body-worn camera. Well, the ripple through is that then creates more footage and video requirements that the Commonwealth attorney has to review as a part of their review process to determine, what's prosecutable, what isn't. So it increases the demand on their staff. And so this is their request to fulfill that. And the request was actually for 4 FTEs. Commonwealth attorneys not as good as negotiators as the police, so I was able to talk them down to 2 with a planned phase-in next year where they're going to take these 2, evaluate over the course of the year, ensure they're in line with their demands for services, and then we're going to talk again in the next budget process. Mental health services, I kind of jumped ahead to this. Something, that second bullet point, public safety, wellness. So that became a really critical thing that was an eye-opener after the 5/31, the May 31st tragedy, is this need for public safety and mental health and this ability for them to get counseling and the services that they need. So something that is being put forward by the city manager, the proposed budget, is the use of about $500,000 in attrition savings or vacancy savings to fund this initiative, and to provide public safety related departments the ability to get outside counseling services should they desire that. Something that is really exciting in my mind is the Human Services consolidation in Pembroke 6. So Human Services at Pembroke 6 is a building there off the boulevard, and a lot of Human Services operations occur in that building. They have the first 5 floors of that. And with the expansion of their services to the 6th floor, it's going to allow more of a one-stop shop for individuals in need. So before, what they used to experience were individuals, they would then come there, they'd get care, and they'd say, okay, well, you need to go over here to this for mental services over here, and they would send them to different points where the Human Services was spread out across the city. So what this is going to do is allow Human Services to consolidate some of those and create more of a one-stop shop where all somebody needs to do is go in between the floors and get the assistance that they need. And they're thinking that this will provide the gap that they were seeing where some people just weren't going and following up just because limitation of transportation needs or whatever it is. So this is really an exciting initiative, I feel like. And the good thing about this one is it's a one-time investment from the general fund of a build-out of the lease space in the floor, and then through Medicaid reimbursements of the services they're going to be delivering in future years, it'll cover the annual lease costs associated with this. So it truly is just a one-time investment to build it out, and it should be pretty self-sustaining. Schools, that big 46% of the operating budget I was talking about earlier. So a little bit more granular level look at schools. So the school's proposed budget includes a salary increase of roughly $28 million. That's the equivalent of about a 4.5% step increase for them and a 4.5% COLA. So another initiative schools is putting forward is they're putting $8.5 million towards their health insurance. So what they're looking to do is reduce their employee premiums through the use of that. And then some other initiatives they've done is put $10 million towards making pay band adjustments for some of their hard-to-fill positions. Schools baseline services was able to absorb their debt service costs, as well as they were actually even able to redirect some of their resources to cover PAYGO towards their CIP projects. Just for example, a notable one is the schools has an outdated and payroll and telephone system that's well past their useful life period, and so they're looking to support that initiative in their CIP as well. And then in terms of FTEs, I had noted earlier the 50 FTEs, a notable investment that they're doing there through the allocation of FTEs is establishing a security office and providing their own legal services.
I have a question before you. What is the COLA 4.5% increase in COLA, and what is the CIP?
So, good question. I'm sorry. Sometimes I get stuck in my own vernacular and I move too fast. COLA, cost of living adjustment.
Okay.
So, and then CIP, capital improvement plan or program. So it's a CIP program. Yeah. So looking at the revenues for schools and the city share general fund, several general fund revenues through the revenue sharing formula. It's a formula that city council and school board both jointly adopt, and it's a policy where schools, based on a set number of established revenue sources, they share roughly they share 46.75% of those revenues. So over the course of time, as those revenues grow, schools share 46.75% of that growth. So the proposed budget put forth by the schools through the revenue sharing formula is $484 million. This was the original estimate back at the point in time of the 5-year forecast, and that is done in September, and that's what schools predicated their operating budget on. As we were looking at their operating budget, they also received an increase from the state, which supports $421 million of their operating budget, and the increase from the state was about $21.5 million. So overall, the schools, through the revenue sharing formula, backtracking to that one year over year, they saw growth of about $27 million in local revenues. And they were able to cover all their baseline needs in the proposed budget without any what we call requested but not funded, or the EMT or the EMS positions I was talking about earlier. If the city manager had said no, the resources weren't available, that would have gone to a unfunded need that was requested, but the resources just weren't there to cover it. The schools did not identify any of those in the proposed budget, so their baseline needs were met from the best that we can tell. So I'd mentioned that was predicated on a revenue estimate that was done in September. Based on throughout the course of the operating budget process, we still weren't certain what revenues we're doing. We do a mid-year review typically in January. About that point in time, the real estate assessor also provided us an updated real estate assessment number, where assessment growth was projected and is now projected to be 9.3% year over year, as opposed to the 3.8% we had predicated it on. So that translated into some additional revenue that came in late in the budget process. And so what this bullet point here is talking about is, if that additional revenue at that point in time was run through the school funding formula, it would have resulted in providing schools an additional $22 million above and beyond the $484 that their budget was predicated on. And at that point in time, like I said, there was no identified needs that warranted or justified sending it back over to schools at that point in time to fund. So as a result, the proposed budget established what I've called a hold harmless dedication. It's roughly equivalent about 3.2 cents of the real estate tax rate. And what it does is it lock boxes or withholds that $22 million from being applied to the school funding formula and allows City Council to redirect those towards other critical needs in the city. One of which is to put that towards the newly established flood protection program. I'll go ahead and skip forward to that one. So the flood protection program, this is a newly established fund in the operating budget, and the intention of this fund is to act as a lockbox of real estate revenue, so that way it can sustainably support the debt service associated with future issuances related to the flood protection program bond referendum amount of $567 million. So based on the revised per penny, the need for that fund is the equivalent of a 4.1 cent real estate tax dedication. That translates to about $28 million. Several of you, and I know this group's very involved, might recall back in November, City Council adopted a resolution that said if this referendum's approved by the voters, then City Council will put in place a 4.3 cent real estate tax increase associated with to provide payment for the debt service associated with the bond referendum. Because of the higher growth in real estate assessment that I noted earlier, that was actually the only amount needed is 4.1 cent to sustainably support those. So the proposed budget increase recommends a rate increase of only 2.3 cents as opposed to the 4.1. That additional 1.8 cent gap is being covered through that hold harmless dedication that I previously mentioned that is being withheld from the school funding formula. Now I know I'm going, seems like full circle. I see some of you shaking your heads because I've provided the presentation to you after and answered some of these questions already, so I'll be glad to circle back on this if I've lost anybody at this point in time. So some other notable changes and modifications in the proposed budget related to other special revenue funds, open space dedication, which provides a site acquisition for open space initiatives throughout the city. It receives a dedicated revenue source in the city through the meals tax. That's being restored to its original purpose, which is associated with site acquisition, as opposed to what it had transitioned to in more recent years of Parks and Rec maintenance initiatives. And then the proposed budget also extends the sunset dedications associated with the tip and the tap fund.
Can you speak to that and how we should all keep paying those fees forever? Because, they were sunsetted when they were created. And did somebody come to you, or was it the city manager, or how did that happen? So
the Resort Investment Committee or Commission and the Resort Advisory Commission, the RIC and the RAC, so those were established back in the original establishment of the TGIF, the Tourism Growth Investment Fund, these boards were set up to act as kind of not governing bodies, but as advisory committees to the recommendations out in the utilization of the major projects, the TGIF, which is now all that's combined into the TIP fund. Those committees, they make recommendations based on the initiatives that are found within the resort area or within some of these tourism-related industries. And so as a result of their work, they had put together a request for us to revisit, hey, if we were to extend the sunset provisions in perpetuity of these self-imposed taxes such as hotel, meals tax, and representatives on there come from the hotel industry and the restaurant industry. They wanted to see what capacity they would have to make some critical investments in areas of the city that they feel like are large needs. So basically, through the result of extending the TIP fund dedications, it's allowed the proposed CIP to include a $200 million fairly robust investment plan within the local economy for tourism-related investments and initiatives throughout the city. And that really came as a result of several, studies and plans that have been put in place in the past, such as the resort area mobility plan, the ramp, there's the RACEAP plan, and there's a lot of these needs that are identified within those, but there just has not been resources or the capacity to put towards those in the past. So a lot of the proposed CIP includes some of those initiatives that have been long desired by areas of the city. There just has not been resources to do that. So that's where the extension of that is going and what that is allowing.
This is a year where we have 8.5% inflation in the month of March, and most families are struggling, and we're looking at 11.1 tax increase. And the timing is really poor, and we're going to give $45 million to the resort. I mean, this is all resort. So if there was any way to get more information on this, it would just be great, because I'm personally concerned about the families more than I am about the resort expansion or the RACEAP or the resort advisory committee. And I did send you some questions about it, so I'm just concerned. So I'll let you keep going.
All right.
Just a quick question
Okay.
about the tip. You keep calling it a hotel tax, and Sandbridge is all short-term rentals. They also pay the same hotel tax that goes to the oceanfront. And we were told it would be sunsetted. At what point is Sandbridge, who did not suffer any vacancies during COVID, like the hotels did, at what point does Sandbridge, who also pays for their own sand and pays for their own equipment and their own everything, at what point do we set up our hotel tax from the TIP fund and stop sending that funding to the oceanfront? Because that's a big ATM machine right there.
The Sandbridge retains 6.5% of the hotel tax rate. So the TIP fund actually does not get any of the Sandbridge TIP.
It gets
It gets the short-term rental money.
Yeah, the short-term rental money, the $2 per night
It gets
hotel fee still goes to
the $2 for the hotel per day.
So the one, yeah, okay. So yes, so the tax rate in terms of the 5% that I was talking about that the TIP fund gets, netted from that, the Sandbridge district retains its 5% of that. And so the TIP fund doesn't get the base tax rate. Then the Sandbridge has the additional 1.5% on top of that. So the Sandbridge charges 6.5%, or they charge 9.5%.
10.5.
And
Now, it went up a percent last year.
If you include the state percent.
of the state, that the city, I see what you're talking about, yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm thinking city, general fund, we don't get that 1% that the state gets, it goes directly to the state.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so, I'm sorry, you're right. But of the local amount, the hotel taxes generated within the Sandbridge barrier, that district, it retains 6.5% of that total tax rate. But the $1 per room night that is charged there's a $2 per room night that's charged. Sandbridge retains $1 that's generated within the Sandbridge district.
For the sand.
Correct. And then $1 does go to the tip, and I think that's the equivalent of about $92,000.
Okay, people have been giving me,
Sorry.
so you all stop blurting out.
Sorry.
I'm going to skip to the revenues if y'all are okay with that, and because I think that might be one thing. So this is just visual to put some context as to what the overall rate might be for the real estate. The proposed rates included in the budget to request it to go up 2.3 cents. That'll result in a tax rate of 1.013 per 100. So the other notable adjustments, I mentioned fee increases earlier within the planning department. There's a proposal to increase some permits and inspection fees associated with some needs within the planning department as a result of building code changes and the need to provide same-day services and turnaround on those. Those are being requested. Just noting here, stormwater, waste management fee are flat. There's no proposed increases in those. This is just the discussion with some context is the 6.8% growth I was talking about in revenues. So some of the more notable ones, there's boxes around them. So the third one down, you can see general sales year over year is growing about 28.9%, with the restaurant growing 43%, amusement 61%, and the hotel 45%. So again, the reason for those rebound, or the reason for that seemingly high level of growth is because in the proposed budget in 22, we still weren't certain how quick the economy was recovering or what was going on with the revenues, and we were too conservative in our revenue estimates. We didn't see, everything recovering as quickly as it has. So whenever you take that snapshot in time with what we're seeing, it represents significant growth budget to budget in several of those.
Okay, are you ready for questions or you got more?
This is context. This is actually, I just don't want anybody to think that I'm shying away from any of this, is because including the proposed budget each year, one of the things we do is we try to do an annual tax calculation of the impact on the typical Virginia Beach family. And this is a visual year over year. So what we're anticipating based on our assumptions is a growth of about $374 per year last year, our current year to FY23. And large portion of that, or the majority of that's associated with the 2.3 cent real estate tax. With all that in mind, even with the proposed, Virginia Beach is still the lowest or tied for the lowest in the region in terms of taxes. And the only thing, context, because this group's vocal, April 20th is the public hearing at the convention center at 6 p.m. To where people can come talk to city council about the proposed budget that I just talked with y'all. And then there's another public hearing that'll be taking place on April 26th at city council chambers. So with that being said,
Okay, some of these questions you'll probably go through really quickly, okay? Can you go back to the hold harmless? Somebody wants you to explain that again for them.
I knew that one. Okay. All right. So this one or this one?
For the revenue share formula, at what dollar figure does the revenue share stop and fund city initiatives other than schools?
Okay. So it's a formula that's reevaluated once every 3 years. Until it's being reevaluated, the 46.75% that I was talking about will be the share that schools will get of those revenues and the growth in those revenues, unless City Council makes a decision, a determination to, if you will, put a lockbox around some revenue sources and dedicate those, and by doing that, they then withhold that from being shared with schools in its entirety. So City Council does have that flexibility. For example, they did it last year during the reconciliation process to support some of these public safety initiatives and provide an 8.5% increase to the police officers. They dedicated 1 cent of the real estate tax rate for that initiative. And in doing so, that withheld that funding, based on the current policy from the school funding formula and retained that within the general fund to support that initiative. Does that answer?
Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Will police and deputy sheriffs all wear body cameras, or is it just police?
So right now, it is just police. I believe there has been discussion about the possibility of expanding that initiative and that program to the correctional facility for sheriff deputies, but no investment or resources have been put towards that. And again, I would certainly need to have a roundtable powwow with all the players, IT and Commonwealth Attorney, to see what the impact on their services would be.
But all the police will have body cameras,
Yes.
and will they be turned on at all times when they're on duty? This is a very useful thing.
I don't think at all times when they're on duty, but I believe my last understanding was they were looking for at the technology of if they drew a weapon, or then it would activate. I think there was a little issue that they were having trying to get that to be consistent in the footage actually activating, as opposed to somebody knowingly flipping a switch and turning it on. But in addition to the body-worn cameras, and it might be intermittent when they engage, but they've also expanded it to be inclusive of their vehicles. So now they're actually retaining some of the video footage from the vehicles, and the Commonwealth Attorney is acting as the repository of all that and getting downloads from all that.
And there's enough money for every cop to have one of these things?
That is my understanding, yes.
That's great.
Okay. What amount of the proposed tax increase is for flooding?
So the proposed tax increase of 2.3 cents, 100% of that is for flooding. So within the flood protection, that fund I was talking about, the bond referendum fund, 4.1 cents total, 2.3 of the tax increase is going into that, and 1.8 cents is being redirected from the general fund, or the organic growth of the general fund and the real estate tax, and being directed over there.
Were there any discrepancies in the last budget? If so, what were they? Do you get audited every year?
So we get audited in terms of the city's overall financial. It's typically part of the CAFR, but what they do as a part of that CAFR is they look at the budget that is put in place. So that's certainly something that they're doing. They call us in there and they have me show them all the public hearing ads and make sure that we met all the legal sufficiency and requirements as established by state code. So we do go through that exercise.
Okay. What is the actual profit made at the ocean front, and how much goes to spending? And where do much spending goes, whatever? What is the actual profit made at the ocean front? What is the actual profit made at the ocean front? Where much of the spending goes?
Return on investment.
So try not to get too granular in this, because it's a difficult thing to quantify.
They don't separate it by area.
That's the challenge. And when we gather, people pay, like if someone's here and they're using their credit card, that credit card information, the zip code associated with that doesn't translate throughout to then get tracked to whenever tax revenues generated by the city, we know how much is generated from where. It's a really tricky thing to try to say this much came from this area. We actually are working on something for a grant.
Commissioner of Revenue's working on it.
Yeah, well, the Commissioner of Revenue is working on it to help us identify something. So I believe Public Works Transportation is looking to apply for a grant, and a part of the grant qualifying factors is related to, is it economic initiatives or economic activity or something. And so they're seeing if they can get good qualifying data to use to give them extra points in the scoring system of that to qualify for this grant. So, but I don't have it.
Commissioner
Okay.
Chatellier, it's apparently hard.
It's very hard. It's very hard to get.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should make that area there a special service district.
An SSD.
Yes.
Okay, the General Assembly passed a law that allows localities to charge less than the inflated fair market value on car tax. Will Virginia Beach take advantage of the ability to assess vehicles less than the fair market value?
Yes.
Yes.
So, that one there, and so in the current year was $38 million. If everything held true next year and the budget's not predicated on this, we took city council direction, applied the fair market value approach, and that resulted in reducing the personal property taxes in '23 by $42.9 million from our initial estimate by applying that methodology.
Okay. Exactly what will it cost to give employees step and COLA? Are they getting a raise and then step and COLA on top of that? Or is
So,
that the raise?
I can say this for context.
Can you put that screen back up just for a second?
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, no mean to interrupt, but I want to get a picture of it. Thank you.
It's also online.
So, and it was the last slide, but this might help for the context that was being asked. So this bullet point here, for every 1% increase in the general fund, it's the equivalent of $4.3 million.
Okay.
So if you took the entire $32.8 million that I said was in a compensation reserve, if city council was to take that and say, hey, we want to do all of that with a cost of living adjustment, it would equate to about 7.5% in terms of what that would be in terms of a increase to employees' pay. But in terms of the layering of the step, that's still something that HR is working out with consultants, because it was initially, the market salary survey was to look and compare Virginia Beach pay scale salaries to the market. Then at the last bit of that analysis, it was requested that the consultant look at incorporating a step plan and what the cost of that might be. There's been multiple things, but in terms of the order of how that would be applied, I'm not certain what the overall cost is going to be of a step plan for just public safety versus public safety and the rest of the workforce. It's still very much a working thing that I believe is going to be presented. And
That was the 32 million on the side there?
the 32 million is, yes, is a set aside that city council could allocate for that or whatever purpose they want.
So that doesn't include the raise in it?
A raise has not been put forward as by the city manager saying, hey, we want to do the step, we want to implement the market, and we want to give a 2% COLA or anything. It's
So,
kind,
yeah, the 32 million includes the raise and step or COLA or whatever?
it would
Oh,
cover
okay.
it, slice and dice however council wants
Oh,
to do it.
okay.
Yes, sorry.
So, didn't know if it was separate or not.
Can I ask a question, because I'm wondering, do you do some kind of formula where you look at increase of, because basic teachers, police, whatever, that's all government jobs. Do you do a comparison to that, to how much the inflation, because the cost of living is gonna go here, but here they get more, but we're also, the private sector is also paying more, but they're not getting cost of living raises. Is there some kind of a balance?
So,
Sorry.
so I'm trying to, so in terms of doing a comparison to what the private sector and the market is doing, historically, it has not been any level of data or analysis because the data is not readily available. We don't know what all the business is, what the private sector is doing out there, one employer. So the closest peek behind the curtain we've had in a long time is Centera, right? Because Centera is struggling, so Centera blasted it out there in the pilot as to what they're doing by, hey, we're gonna give this market adjustment 5%, but that's not always readily available for us to do a comparison. In the past, it's typically compensation adjustments have been to this level of whatever the city can afford after maintaining the other stuff.
Okay, you had a chart there on revenue, because there was the next question, what will city collect in property tax and revenue increases? And that is that right there, okay? So these relate, this inflation is caused by our government in DC, how much spending goes to private public spending. So when you have that over there, real estate is assessments is going up 11.97%.
Almost 12, and that's.
Almost 12, so the revenue neutral rate you said at city council was going to be 0.91 cents.
Correct. So this is inclusive of the tax increase, right? So the 2.3% real estate increase is the reason that that's not actually the 9.3%. So assessments are really growing the 9.3%, so that's reflective of revenue, which is inclusive of the tax rate.
So the actual tax increase is 11.1% as put in the public hearing statement,
So,
because of the increase in real estate assessments and the increase in the 2.3 tax.
going from the revenue neutral tax rate that's required by code to put out in that public hearing ad, yes, that's the increase.
So this person wants to know, so what private-public spending, so the public-private partnerships, I guess that would be economic development, tourism, set-asides for that? Or is there any other set-asides for public-private categories in the budget?
No, the only one that I'm familiar with in terms of any type of a rebate or anything that's actually going to be active would be for the City View development in Town Center. And that one's